The following serial killers have at least 13 to 17 confirmed murders. Let's get started. Albert DeSalvo, aka the Boston Strangler. The average person has around 10 pints of blood in their body, 10 pints of life fluid that keeps them alive. The size of the average beer keg varies wildly by country and measurement and whatnot, but a recurring figure I get is 124 pints. If the keg held blood, it could hold the blood of over 13 people. 13. It's this figure we've reached with DeSalvo, who killed 13 women aged 19 to 85 in the early 60s in the state of Massachusetts. Most were raped, the average age was around 50, and the victims were of different ethnicities. He was also a rapist before escalating to murder, and one of his rape victims would be instrumental in identifying DeSalvo. Apparently it was a rough confession, and as we've seen before and will see since, irresponsible policing can be very problematic. However, modern DNA has proved DeSalvo really was the killer. Should we totally trust detective intuition? No. It's just, in this case, a rough approach just happened to yield the correct result. But even heavy hitter Robert Ressler was not convinced DeSalvo was responsible for all 13 murders. Ultimately, DeSalvo was killed in prison, and had actually escaped from custody at one point. These are interesting points around a controversial case, but now comes a series of details that are starting to make this project boring. Let's see how many we can guess. DeSalvo's early life involved an alcoholic father who engaged in sexual acts with prostitutes in front of his children and severely abused his wife. DeSalvo soon made acquaintances with juvenile delinquency and started torturing small animals. In later life, he enlisted in the United States Army. What his IQ was varies wildly, and supposedly he staged a lot of his victims. Joseph DaAngelo, aka the Golden State Killer. In all my studying of true crime, it's only recently I was introduced to the concept of a psychological sadist. Fortunately, it's not a concept that comes up that often, but it does so here, and with nightmarish results. But before we explore that, there's something else. I did say that Dennis Rader had evaded capture the longest, and that record would be held until the end. But it's a record only held if you don't consider James DaAngelo. His crime spree was from 1979 to 86, but he was only captured in 2018, thus making him at large for 40 years. This is easily the longest period of time from any case in this project. At this point, I ask myself what differentiates an active serial killer from a deactive serial killer. Is there a difference? Does it matter? Rader was still corresponding with the police and thus technically still active, while DaAngelo had gone underground for nearly 30 years. Either way, it's not an issue that will come up again, but it's worth mentioning here. Joseph DaAngelo was ultimately responsible for at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries throughout the course of his life. He was a one-man crime wave, and it's hard to imagine anyone embodies the worst of psychopathy more than him. As far as we know, there's little in the way of confirmed trauma history, except one incident when he was a child and witnessed the rape of his then 7-year-old sister. A deeply visceral and upsetting encounter, but it's worth wondering, was this incident traumatic or exciting? Or perhaps both? Children often misinterpret things as sexual, hence why there are so many weird fetishes. Is it possible young DaAngelo saw his sister's brutal rape as inspiration rather than horrific? Perhaps it's cynical of me to even consider so, but those of you who already know what kind of man DaAngelo is might see it as plausible. He was a burglar and torturer of small animals as far back as his teens, and joined the United States Navy when he was 19 in 1964. It isn't clear how much active combat he saw, but upon returning he wasted no time enrolling with the police force, with apparent gusto. Although he was fired for a shoplifting incident, it seems likely that DaAngelo got away with most of his crimes as a young man. Furthermore, he gave his criminal career a sense of unsettling professionalism, displaying creative cunning in his burglaries. He was a gifted stalker, capable of staying absolutely still for prolonged periods, and actually preferred to target the middle class rather than those who are most vulnerable. DaAngelo would place bottles and warning items near doors. He'd break in before his attack and leave tools he might need. When a couple was targeted, DaAngelo would have the male tied up and then stack dishes on his back. If the dishes fell, DaAngelo said he'd kill everyone in the house. Then he raped the female, stole anything he wanted, and left. He did this many times and devastated many people. I try not to imagine the fear, pain, humiliation, helplessness of it all. DaAngelo's cruelty was furthered by his tendency to taunt the surviving victims both before and after their attack. One time he called a previous victim on Christmas Day. DaAngelo would also taunt the police and even sent a poem to the media. He then stepped up to murder in 1979, typically killing couples. He was meticulous, methodical, and very clever. Ultimately, DNA evidence caught him, but only in 2018, a long time after he'd committed his crimes. And while he committed those crimes, he had his family who loved him and had no idea. Detective Paul Holes spearheaded this initiative, allowing them to catch DaAngelo. Catching one of the most elusive serial killers is a great thing, and Paul Holes is another true crime hero.
And I'm really sorry to everyone I've hurt. Thank you, Eugene.
Herbert Mullin. With this case, we revisit some less ubiquitous tropes of the project, the first being paranoid schizophrenia. Notably, the rest of Herbert's early life seemed free of obvious trauma events, until late adolescence, where one of his childhood friends died in a car accident. Mullin was reportedly devastated, increasing his intake of drugs, particularly LSD, and was in and out of mental institutions for years as his schizophrenia grew. Over those years he built a grandiose delusion that earthquakes were coming, and they could be prevented via acts of murder. What followed was a 4-month rampage of bludgeoning, stabbing, beating, and mostly shooting, all in the name of appeasing the universe to prevent a natural disaster. One of his victims was a hitchhiker he picked up, and at one point he killed a whole family, including a 4-year-old boy. There was another occasion where he massacred 4 teenage boys in a park with his .22 caliber pistol. Mullin tried to join the army, giving him a safer way to make sacrifices, but was refused entry when he wouldn't sign his criminal record. Mullin was not particularly careful or clever and was soon arrested. But during Mullin's crime spree, Ed Kemper was also still at large, thus confusing the police investigation, determining who killed who. The two actually met in prison, and Kemper held the nonsensical, random, chaotic Mullin in contempt. Kemper would throw water on Mullin when he misbehaved, and gave him peanuts when he was good. Mullin died a few months ago actually, and it's unknown what Kemper had to say about it. The case makes me think, if we truly believe that small-time killing could prevent a catastrophe, would we do it? What if we were convinced we were in the trolley problem at all times? Despite his psychosis, Mullin reminds us of the huge difference between madness and malice, but the blood of his victims could still fill a regular-sized beer keg. William Bonin and Accomplices, aka the Freeway Killer. One recurring problem of the project is the unreliability of the figure of how many people a given serial killer has murdered. Kills they've gotten away with notwithstanding, in most of my studies I've ordered these perpetrators on the number of confirmed deaths, or at least the number they were sentenced for. It's a guarantee that many serial killers have been underestimated, and saying Bonin is responsible for the deaths of quote-unquote only 14 teenage boys is the latest understatement. Wikipedia puts Bonin's body count at 21, which should place the Freeway killer into the next chapter and thus the bottom third. But the 14 names listed will set his position here. Bonin is suspected of 36 to 44 total kills. Both of Bonin's parents were alcoholics, the father was a tyrant and possibly traumatized war veteran, and William and his brothers were severely neglected. Bonin wound up in a Catholic convent ostensibly to protect him from abuse, but his situation got worse. Between beatings, torture, cruelty, and even attempted drowning, I wonder if those responsible felt any guilt. It gets worse. Bonin is said to have been raped by an older boy, or even boys, at this convent. Bonin's parents never visited, so he suffered alone. But sooner or later he lived with his maternal grandfather, a convicted child molester who sexually abused Bonin's mother for years. It's likely he raped Bonin as well. The boys were also at the mercy of the oldest sibling who would beat them, but I find no evidence of rape from him. Bonin was a juvenile delinquent. He was molested by a counsellor, and he started molesting his own brothers. My head is spinning at the thought of this, everyone taking out their endless pain and frustration on everyone else. This is the first case in a while where it's very clearly an example of an extreme trauma history, and we've barely entered adolescence. Poverty was characteristic of Bonin's background, owing to his father being a gambling addict, and they wound up homeless at one point. Bonin did attend school, but was socially impaired and an outcast. He was rejected by women, but I can't confirm what his sexual orientation even was. Straight, gay, bisexual, paedophile, it's not clear. It's likely he molested young boys from the neighbourhood. It caused further clashes with his mother, who evicted him at least once. Bonin then joined the United States Air Force and fought in Vietnam. Involvement in the armed forces is very common with psychopaths and killers, but Bonin is one of the few that seem to witness active combat, maybe even as much as 700 hours of it. Bonin was decorated for his service and honourably discharged, but it's clear he committed atrocities during his service and was further traumatised by the war. There's also a note about his fiancée going off with another man while he was in Vietnam, but I don't know how to feel about that. Bonin would be convicted of several counts of molestation, rape, assault, torture, even kidnapping. He was institutionalized and diagnosed with manic depression, bipolar disorder, sexual sadism disorder, and antisocial personality disorder. If my research is correct, ASPD wasn't used as a diagnosis or even as a term until 1980, the publication of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 3, so I really don't know about any of this. He was also said to have an above-average IQ. Despite such a long list of crimes already, he was released after a few years. Bonin wasted no time in raping and attempting to murder a teenage hitchhiker. He was arrested, imprisoned, and released again. Before long, Bonin had met several people, maybe as many as 4, who shared his dark desires, and things began escalating. They collectively murdered hitchhikers. The youngest known victim was 12 years old, so the child killer and child molester tags are relevant here. But Bonin was also a torturer and rapist, and committed gross acts of violence. At least one victim had his genitals cut off. Any of his accomplices could have put a stop to this, but they did not. Furthermore, Bonin violated his parole and should have been sent back to prison, but a clerical error kept him on the streets long enough to rack up a high body count very quickly. I'm tempted to blame the court, but something like this feels more like the grace of the devil. The brutality and horrors each victim endured in the back of that infamous van are well documented. Bonin is certainly one of the most hated of all serial killers, and the acts of callousness and mutilation are among some of the worst I've read thus far. He was caught in the act of yet another rape, and finally arrested. There was more than enough evidence, but he was mysteriously cleared of some of the murders. This links into the confusion I had in the opening paragraph for this case. Regardless, Bonin was still sentenced to death. While incarcerated, he kept some details to himself out of spite, and even taunted some of the victims' families in written correspondence. He also became friends with other death row serial killers, including Lawrence Bittaker and Douglas Clark, whom I've previously covered. He also knew Randy Kraft, who we will get to in due time. It's satisfying there's so much information on this case, even if some of it is questionable. There isn't time to get into Bonin's accomplices, Fraser, Butts, Miley, Monroe. Suffice it to say they were all weak and stupid people, and part of me wonders if this should be considered a cult. Bonin was executed in 1996. Carl Eugene Watts, aka the Sunday Morning Slasher. Our first black serial killer in a while, Carl Watts killed between 14 and over 100 women in the 70s and early 80s. His father was in the army, and he left the family after separation. A case of meningitis may have contributed to Watts's low intelligence, around 75 IQ. Some sources put that IQ as low as 68. Now underperforming at school, Watts was bullied quite severely and began his fantasies about torturing and killing women. His grandmother reported that he always liked hunting and skinning rabbits, so I'm going to tag him as an infant zoo sadist as well. He committed a physical assault as a teenager and was institutionalized. A few years after release, he began his murders, targeting almost exclusively young white women. He killed using a variety of methods in a variety of locations. He is allegedly a torturer and a kidnapper, but the details are scarce, and perhaps most interestingly, he is not a rapist. This is a very unusual combination of elements, but supposedly BTK wasn't a rapist either. At some point, Watts was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. The exact timeline is jumbled as always. Watts was married and divorced at one point as well, his wife leaving him for his strange behaviour. Before and since he'd been attacking women in a blitz style similar to Peter Sutcliffe. I think his youngest victim was 14 years old. It doesn't seem to be known why he targeted white women, or why he wasn't sexually motivated, or what the torture involved. There was one theory that Watts's hatred of women resulted from the death of an uncle who was supposedly murdered by female relatives, and Watts was allegedly diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. I'm not going to include that tag, but it's a possibility. There was a worry Watts would secure early release due to a quirk in the law that required authorities to declare to him that water is not lethal, or something to that effect. Watts had allegedly drowned one of his victims. Watts may well have been released early had he not tried and failed to escape, and Watts then died of prostate cancer in 2007. Robert Hansen, aka Butcher Baker. Robert Hansen frequently appears on worst lists owing to how theatrical he was. His infamous MO was to kidnap prostitutes, release them into the Alaskan wilderness, and use a gun to hunt them like animals. He did this many times, and it's certainly a frightening and memorable act. Hansen briefly worked in the army and as a police assistant drill instructor, but details pertaining to his early life are sketchy. I can't accurately assess what his parents were like, for instance. It does seem he had a bad time at school, resenting female students and being possessed with an anger so intense he burned down a school garage when he was 21. He was assessed after his arrest and diagnosed with bipolar disorder and being somewhat schizophrenic. After release, he committed a number of thefts and a number of rapes and attempted rapes. The exact details of his prison time isn't clear either, and I'm a little skeptical. Aged around 33, he started his more infamous crimes. He'd rape the woman before flying to a remote area and beginning his grim sport. It seemed likely one of his victims did get away, only to freeze to death. Hansen himself seemed above suspicion until John Douglas gave the police a profile that was strikingly accurate but somewhat general. Low self-esteem, a history of being rejected by women, and had a stutter. The last detail is significant, but otherwise I'm not clear how the conclusions were reached and whether or not they were sufficient. The profile also said the killer kept souvenirs, and it turns out this was true as well. Hansen's final would-be victim, Cindy Paulson, escaped out the car back door and was able to flag down a truck. After that, it was a matter of time before authorities caught Hansen. Paulson had been raped and tortured by Hansen, but she lived and memorised key details and got Butcher Baker put away. She is definitely another hero of true crime. Bruce George Peter Lee, aka the Hull Arsonist. As the worst of British continues into a new chapter, I'm again struck with how little serial killers from the UK have in common. The others had a particular type, a different type from each other, but a type nonetheless. George Peter had no type, as the act itself was the goal. He was a prolific arsonist and caused a lot of damage in Hull. George Peter took the name of the martial arts star presumably to look cool, and started nearly a dozen fires in the 70s and caused perhaps 26 deaths, counted as manslaughter. Again, finding and settling on an exact figure was difficult. 15 kills seems to be the strongest average, as he was somehow cleared of 11 deaths. His mother was a prostitute, he was brought up in a children's home, and he suffered from epilepsy and other physical ailments. Not much else is known about him, but it's been said his IQ was as low as 68, and I seem to notice people with a fascination with fire tend to have low IQs. George Peter's last attack killed an entire family, a family who was very unpopular with the neighbourhood, and whom George Peter had a grudge against. George Peter confessed, and then confessed to several other fires that had caused fatalities, fires that hadn't been regarded as suspicious. It's frightening to think he could have gotten away with it. Burning to death is one of the worst fates a human can suffer. No one deserves that, and we can only hope suffocation by smoke inhalation took them first. Amongst George Peter's victims was even a 6-month-old baby. Manuel Moore and accomplices, aka the Zebra Murderers. Manuel Moore was one of 4 black serial killers responsible for at least 15 murders in the 70s around California, and particularly San Francisco. This is a strangely obscure case. I don't even know who the real leader was, but the group calling themselves the Death Angels consisted of Moore, Larry Green, Jessie Lee Cooks, and JCX Simon. They are the only black group in this project, and they targeted white people. The killings were chaotic, random, and naturally there may be many more than just the 15 this group gunned down. One night was a killing spree with 5 deaths, and there is a further story of kidnapping and torturing a homeless man. They got their killer nickname after the radio channel assigned to the case, and they even made an assassination attempt at the mayor. Today, 3 of these killers have died of old age, and 1 is still alive in prison. Again, details are sketchy, and besides their affiliation with the Nation of Islam, who paid for their defence, little is documented about them. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins, aka the meanest man in America. Gaskins killed perhaps 15 people over a prolonged period of time across South Carolina. His early life strikes me as savage, a juvenile delinquent with a string of criminal offences such as burglary, assault, rape, the list goes on. He even participated in a gang rape. Perhaps he became so brutal due to parental neglect that was so bad that, according to Wikipedia, the first time he learned his given name was when it was read out in his first court appearance. A pretty telling detail, but other details about his past stick out as well. He was small in stature, about 5'4", and thus a target. He was regularly raped while in reform school. After a few brutal years, after another arrest for assault as a young man, Gaskins went to prison. Gaskins then killed the most feared prison inmate called Hazel Brazel by slitting his throat. This was likely Gaskins' first kill, and it brought him some respect in prison. After a few years in prison, he escaped and joined a travelling carnival. Gaskins strikes me as one of the most colourful and tragic cases I've covered thus far. He was released from prison in 1968 at the age of 35, having prior been rearrested for the rape of a 12-year-old girl. I'm surprised his sentences were so light, and they keep stacking up. His first murder outside of prison was a hitchhiker he tortured before killing. His victims strike me as random, crimes of opportunity against men and women, with the murder method varying wildly. I'm skeptical regarding a lot of these details. It all seems a bit outlandish. Indeed, Gaskins would later write a book about his exploits, a book I've not read and won't indulge in. It's likely nonsense, just like the books written by Rizzle, Panzram, Berkowitz and Picton. Maybe I should have started a tag for that. It is confirmed Gaskins murdered his own niece. He raped and drowned a young woman and her baby, and had a diverse collection of murders which got him arrested yet again, and some of those murders seem to be related to other criminal accomplices, making Gaskins somewhat related to organised crime. When he was caught and imprisoned, he had one final caper where he killed someone while in prison via explosives. This got him another death sentence, the first of its kind given he was a white man who killed a black man. Gaskins was finally executed via electric chair in 1991. Allegedly, there's some kind of connection to William Pierce, and allegedly he had a fondness for urethra torture, which is very nasty. But the thing about psychopaths is they're pathological liars. Hopefully more can be learnt from more reliable sources. Raphael Angel Resendes, aka the Railway Killer. I think this is our first Hispanic serial killer, born in Mexico and killed in both Mexico and the States. Getting his handle via the means he travelled, he killed at least 15 people but is suspected of 23 murders, some of which he raped and others he did not. He was likely homeless for the entirety of his crimes, making him hard to detect, and by freight train hopping, he evaded authorities for nearly a decade and a half, committing a myriad of crimes and taking trophies from the victims, usually driver's licenses or jewellery. There doesn't seem to be a type of victim, and the ages range from 16 to 87, and the ethnicities are just as varied. Bludgeoning seems to be the preferred method of murder, and one of his would-be victims who he raped after murdering her boyfriend did live to tell her tale and testify in court. He committed a lot of burglary during his criminal career. Ultimately, his sister persuaded him to turn himself in. This case is a prime example of knowing a lot about the crime and very little about the criminal. Randy Kraft, aka the Scoreboard Killer. The second Freeway Killer, or possibly the first. Like William Bonin before him, he targeted young men, but the similarities and differences between the other Freeway Killer need to be weighed carefully. Kraft killed at least 16 young men in the 70s and early 80s, but as evident by his personal scorecard, the number of murders may be much higher, as is the way for most of these killers. Looking at his early life, it seems as if he had a normal working-class background. Perhaps his father was a little too aloof, but there's every indication he was loved by his mother and sisters. He seemed to do fine in school and was even praised for his high intelligence. It's been a while, but this is another killer with a low trauma history. He enlisted in the United States Air Force, did quite well, but was discharged after disclosing his homosexuality. His father was said to greatly and angrily disapprove, and Kraft's mother wasn't too pleased either. A year or so later, Kraft beaten, drugged, and raped a 13-year-old boy. Somehow, no charges were filed. A year later, the killings started. All known victims were between 13 and 35, making them on average older than Bonin's victims, but it seems I can't tag Kraft as a child killer or child molester, given the lowest age was 13. Many of the victims were members of the United States Marine Corps, and drugs and alcohol were involved in many of the murders. This contrasts with Bonin, who I don't think ever used drugs or alcohol. We can only hope those same drugs and booze kept Kraft's victims unconscious and anaesthetized enough so they didn't have to endure the torture Kraft inflicted upon them. Burned with a car cigarette lighter, blunt force trauma, genital mutilation, rectum violation, and dismemberment. And of course, most of them were raped. At least one endured urethra torture. One victim had the worst of it. His eyes were burnt out, genitals cut off and inserted into his rectum. He'd been burnt and sliced up, and it's likely he was conscious through it. Another victim had their scrotum sliced open and a testicle removed. Did Kraft hate himself and his own sexuality so much that he'd take it out so violently on others? The list goes on and on, genital mutilation occurring over and over. Kraft picked up a hitchhiker at least twice, took photographs several times. Investigators later found over 50 photographs of victims dead or unconscious, and at least one occasion bodies had been staged in sexually suggestive poses. Alcohol, Valium, sodomy, bludgeoning, strangulation, emasculation. The words mean nothing but coldness after a while. Kraft was pulled over while drunk with a body in his car. After they searched his house, they found his scoreboard, and the pieces came together quickly. Cryptic names corresponded to victims, but the majority of them still have not been connected to a victim. More worryingly still was the possibility Kraft had an accomplice. Kraft is still on death row as of 2023. So ends the second third of this endeavour. Let's see what patterns emerge from all this data.